Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with news that there will be no restrictions on interstate travel during the Hari Raya Idul Adha period. Senior Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob said there won't be any roadblocks at the border, so you can balik kampung. But let's not forget all the things that we've learned in this past few months about physical distancing measures and personal hygiene, and also to remind ourselves that, you know, our elderly parents might be more at risk than we are.
Melissa, it's a complex issue. I know there's a lot of relief that there won't be an imposition of the kind of stricter rules that we had in the past. But I do feel, and I think this was reflected in some of the statements being made by the Director General of Health, that Malaysians are slipping. And I know that even in the apps that we use to track where we're going and to access spaces, you know, there are prompts on it that say, you know, what do you notice about the people around you? Are most of them wearing masks or not, and so on and so forth? And I wonder how many of us respond to those prompts and, in fact, reveal to the authorities the level of compliance that we actually see.
Well, you know, it's not just those prompts, Sharaad, but would we do that face-to-face, in person? Would we, you know, say to someone, oh, you're not wearing your mask fully, or that, where is your mask, or, you know, to kind of keep distances? Would we say, no hugging or no shaking hands, you know, would we remind each other? And I really do wonder, because there seems to be a little hesitance to do that. I don't know whether it might be misconstrued as aggression or, you know, being overly concerned. What do you think?
Yeah, you know, it is very difficult. I mean, you know, I don't blame other people, because I myself, you know, often forget. It's, you know, it's become muscle memory.
I will remind you.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm very good with my mask, but I'm sometimes, you know, I catch myself trying to shake somebody's hand, especially somebody I haven't seen in a long time.
Right.
You know, when you're the kind of person that is very physical and, you know, tactile, you want to reach out and hug somebody you haven't seen in a long time. Yeah. So that becomes very difficult. I do think, you know, this COVID situation, Melissa, is like the 5 stages of grief. You know, where they say, you know, you start with denial and you end up with acceptance. And I think...
Where are we now?
I think many of us are still in denial. I mean, I don't know, we've gone through the anger and the, you know, and the sorrow and all that, but, you know, certainly acceptance of the changes that we have to make it is very difficult. I don't think a lot of us have arrived at that point.
Well, definitely to balik kampung, but balik kampung with vigilance, you know, to remember to perhaps remind ourselves not to have too many people. I believe not more than 20 people are allowed to gather in one home during Hari Raya Haji, but also to remind ourselves that if, you know, it becomes a triple-digit increase in COVID cases, we might see another lockdown in place again.
Yeah, and because, you know, we're not all in control of these situations. You know, the virus is out there, and there's no stopping it except the kind of physical barriers that we put in its way, right? So, and I see it's not just the festive seasons. You know, many communities have had to skip those festive seasons.
Right.
Christians, you know, didn't get to celebrate Easter in the way they wanted to this year. And then, of course, we had Hari Raya, was, you know, one of the first, I guess, victims of, you know, the lockdown process. But you see in the kind of social gatherings you have at restaurants and pubs and even, you know, the Sunday market. I mean, how many of us are observing that? How many of us go out in big groups to the local mama? And, you know, there is very little physical distancing that is being done there, I think, as well.
All right, well, in other news, in Dewan Rakyat today, we had Finance Minister Tengku Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz saying that banks will suffer an estimated loss of 6.4 billion ringgit over the 6-month moratorium period from April to September. That's more than $1 billion in losses monthly. So Tengku Zafrul also said that the capacity of banks to disburse new loans has also reduced by 79 billion ringgit. All of this was in response to a supplementary question by the former Finance Minister Lim Guan Eng about the losses that was suffered by the banking institutions as a result of the moratorium on borrowings. Now, in his first question, Guan had actually asked if the moratorium would be extended. And to be completely honest, I think that's a question that many businesses have on their minds as well.
Yeah, and businesses and workers in those businesses, Melissa, you know, because the expectation is that without an extension, those businesses will fail. And if they fail, there will be a knock-on effect in terms of employment, right, and so on and so forth, right? So if you watch social media, and I think many people perhaps didn't go to university and do a degree in economics, so, you know, they were reading off the headlines, very critical of the current finance minister, saying, okay, you know, is he there only for the banks? You know, does he care only for the banks and their profits, and so on and so forth? But I don't know if that's sufficient for us to understand what it needs to be done.
I understand the optics, right? The optics don't look good, that the headlines read that these are the losses that banks will suffer from. But, you know, the finance minister was actually responding to a question by the former finance minister. Guan actually asked, what were the losses suffered by the banks? What are the losses that are going to be suffered by the banks? So Zafrul was just responding to that question. And I think the headlines may be more misleading than we are willing to admit.
What I think people want to know is the level of commitment the government has towards supporting businesses and workers.
Exactly.
And whether, you know, in the trade-off between the competing interests that make up our economic, you know, structure, who's going to have to bear the burden? Is it going to be the worker at the end of the day? Right. Or is it going to be the banks, you know, who people say, well, have made super profits throughout their, you know, the boom years.
Last year particularly.
Yeah, so then, you know, if they have to suffer or make sacrifices now, who's going to make the sacrifices, I think, is what people want to hear answered.
Well, yes, and I think certainty is, you know, what business owners want at the moment. If there is not going to be an extension in the moratorium, what assistance then to business owners who may face cash flow problems? I believe, you know,
restructuring is part of the restructuring loans is one of the things that
restructuring.
Absolutely. There are complexities, and, you know, there's not going to be an easy, magical solution to this problem, especially because we don't know how long the uncertainty of this, how deep this recession is going to be, how long the pandemic is going to be disrupting life as we know it. So lots of issues to be discussed, and I'm glad that these questions are being brought up in Parliament that's finally convened.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. Ahead of the verdict on the SRC trial tomorrow, after this we're going to be discussing the issues relating to the broader 1MDB scandal, including that recent Goldman Sachs settlement. That's all coming up in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Now, all eyes will be on the KL High Court tomorrow when Malaysia will learn of the verdict for the 7 charges against Datuk Sri Najib Razak in relation to the 42 million ringgit belonging to SRC International. Now, the SRC trial is one of 5 criminal trials that involve the former Prime Minister. Joining us on the show tonight, we have journalist P. Gunasegaram. He's the author of 1MDB, the scandal that brought down a government. Guna, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Welcome.
Now, before we get into the context of the SRC trial to the larger 1MDB story, I was hoping that we could address some of the developments from over the weekend, specifically the $3.9 billion deal that was reached between the government of Malaysia and Goldman Sachs. Now, Guna, in your opinion, is this settlement considered a victory for Malaysia?
Okay, it's not a US 3.9 billion settlement. The cash settlement is only US 2.5 billion. So the rest, which is US 1.4 billion, is a guarantee by Goldman Sachs that amounts of money which are related to the 6.5 billion in total bonds that they issued, that they made on behalf of 1MDB. At least 1.4 billion will be recovered now. So the effective cash settlement is only US 2.5 billion, and if anything less than US 1.4 billion is recovered, then the shortfall will be made up for by Goldman Sachs. One has to assess the probability of that happening in this case here. Now, already the US DOJ has stated in its report that 4.5 billion has been stolen from 1MDB, and they are recovering assets, which were bought with the stolen money. So they have already recovered several hundred million US dollars worth of assets. So it's very likely that the entire US 1.4 billion could be recovered. So if that is recovered, then Goldman Sachs gets away with just paying US 2.5 billion. So that's not a great deal when you consider that the total liability that the Malaysian government has as a result of this is US 6.5 billion plus interest charges, which are said to be in the region of US 3.1 billion over the maturity period of the bond, taking the total amount up to US dollars 9.6 billion.
Gunnar, Gunnar, if I can jump in here, it was interesting in your kind of opinion piece about the Goldman Sachs settlement. You say that the current finance minister crowed about this particular settlement by saying that under the previous administration, much less would have been, in fact, recovered. And then you go on to show that that was not, in fact, the case. What accounts for the different narratives, I think, being spun out in terms of the Goldman Sachs settlement?
I think the previous finance minister, Lim Guan Eng, said that they were going for a settlement of US dollars 7.5 billion. So in effect, the new finance minister is announcing a deal with that, which is effectively worth just US 2.5 billion, which is actually one-third of what Guan Eng was going for. So Tunku Zafrul doesn't explain the background beyond this whole thing, that the previous administration had already taken action against Goldman Sachs by filing 17 criminal charges against current and former directors of Goldman Sachs, and they were going to claim, according to former Attorney General Tommy Thomas, right, at least US 2.7 billion in fines, plus punitive damages of 10 years of prison for each of the 17 directors.
Okay, but those are individuals in this part of this financial scandal, right? The reason why I'm asking, Guna, and kind of following on of Sharaad's question about differing narratives, global banking analysts have actually noted that in this deal with the Malaysian government, Goldman may have actually paid a premium, but it was worth it because, the stock, it removes a major litigation overhang. I'm just wondering why these are differing narratives, why global analysts covering Goldman stock are saying that, well, they paid too much, but here in Malaysia we're saying we didn't get enough.
I think if you look at Goldman's share price, it actually went up, so which means that the deal is good for Goldman. If you look at Goldman's liability, it comes up to 9.6 billion, including the interest charges. So that is the figure to look at, 9.6 billion. So how much is Goldman's responsible for it? It's possible to argue that Goldman, without Goldman, this cheating of 1MDB could not have occurred. And as a result of that, the Malaysian government has got a 9.6 billion liability. So perhaps Goldman should be liable for perhaps half that amount. So that could be 4.8 billion. And then what about all the criminal charges which are being dropped against Goldman? The criminal charges are against Goldman as well as Goldman directors. So I think what one should be looking for is a settlement of more than US $5 billion. And the previous government had actually been going for US $7.5 billion in settlements.
And I think, sorry, if I could just jump in there. Many people who comment, as we were on your thoughts on this, say that, recovering money is so difficult. We should be grateful that we got this amount. And, won't this be helpful during this recession? Is there some misunderstanding about the way the financial system works and where these monies are going to?
Well, we are not a bankrupt nation, It's not as if, we are dying for the money right now. We could have waited, until it went to trial to get a better bargain. So if you force this whole thing to go to court, and if embarrassing things about Goldman comes out, then Goldman will be under greater pressure to settle. And it's not as if that Goldman does not have the money. And it's not as if they did not contribute to this big loss by 1MDB. I think in the article that I wrote in Malaysia Kimia, I provided a link to Harvard University document which gives a long list of Goldman Sachs offenses, so to speak, against 1MDB. So including things like former CEO Blankfin having been introduced to Najib way back in 2009, and him having met Jolo at least 2 times, and Goldman's compliance department not clearing Jolo and raising questions about how he obtained his work. So these kind of things indicate a huge amount of complicity by Goldman in this entire issue, and it's just not a few rogue traders who have done this. The evidence seems to indicate that knowledge of these wrongdoings were available right at the top of Goldman.
Well,
so in my opinion, Malaysia has a strong case.
Right. Has the 1MDB scandal changed anything about the global financial system? Has it changed anything about the way we were doing business?
Well, I was told, I haven't checked to see whether it's true, that Goldman has not been taken to court for criminal offences in the past. So if Malaysia had pressed this case, then this would have been the first time that Goldman was actually being taken to a criminal court for the deals that he has made. Although there is a long list of offences that Goldman Sachs has committed in many different areas, and these are all well documented, by articles. It has never been brought to the criminal court, and if Malaysia had actually gone out and done that and obtained a criminal conviction on some of these Goldman officials, then it could potentially change a lot of things. As it is, there are just 2 officials, government officials, who are facing criminal charges at the moment, which is Tim Leisner, who was head of ASEAN, and Roger Ng, who was heading up the Malaysian Ops, I think, during that period. So largely, the big investment banks get away with next to murder as far as these things are concerned. They frequently admit to money laundering offences, collusion, and so on. They pay big fines, but nobody goes to jail. So in this case here, there was a possibility that somebody could go to jail, or at least be convicted of jail time in a Malaysian court of law. And that would have been an unprecedented event.
Guna, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with us. We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Tomorrow, we will see a verdict in the SRC trial against former Prime Minister Najib Razak, the first of 5 criminal trials he faces linked to the 1MDB scandal. Now, whatever the verdict, it will no doubt be a landmark decision, as Najib is the highest-ranked politician to be charged in court in this country. Joining us on the line now, we have lawyer Sin Yew. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, in this case, Najib faces 7 charges. That's 3 counts of criminal breach of trust, 3 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of abuse of power. Sin Yew, help us understand some of the key issues which the judge has to decide on tomorrow.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Well, this is obviously a very complex case that has spanned 100 days or so. So whatever overview that I'm giving in the next 5 minutes will not do justice to the sophisticated arguments made by the prosecution and the defense. So hopefully the respected lawyers there won't hold any grudges against me for oversimplifying this.
Neither will we, Sin Yew.
But just to give a summary of what are in consideration here, for the one offence of using office or position for gratification under Section 23 of the MACC Act, the prosecution needs to prove that Datuk Sri Najib is an officer of a public body. Datuk Sri Najib misused his office or position, and the misuse of his office or position was for gratification. For the 3 offences of criminal breach of trust under Section 409 of the Penal Code, the prosecution needs to prove that Datuk Sri Najib is an agent of SRC. Datuk Sri Najib was entrusted with dominion over the 42 million belonging to SRC, and Datuk Sri Najib had dishonestly misappropriated the 42 million, having been trusted with dominion over it. And lastly, for the 3 offences of money laundering under Section 4 of the Anti-Money Laundering Act, the prosecution needs to prove that Datuk Sri Najib has engaged, either directly or indirectly, in a transaction that involves proceeds of an unlawful activity. And the unlawful activity here is the Section 409 charges, which is the CBT, from which the 42 million is derived from. So, at the end of the prosecution stage, the judge has found that the prosecution has proven a prima facie case against Datuk Sri Najib. This means that he must now raise a reasonable doubt through his defence against the prosecution's case. Currently, the task for the judge is to conduct a maximum evaluation based on the totality of the evidence, whether Datuk Sri Najib has raised a reasonable doubt against the charges that are levelled against him. The few key issues, in my mind, which the judge would have to decide tomorrow, is firstly, whether Datuk Sri Najib's role, what was Datuk Sri Najib's role, if any, in SRC International Sdn Bhd, obtaining the 4 billion loan. In this regard, whether his position as the Prime Minister and as the Minister of Finance and his participation in cabinet meetings would amount to a misuse of his position. The second issue is the purpose and the treatment of the 42 million in Datuk Sri Najib's account, whether it belonged to SRC, whether it was misappropriated, if it was misappropriated, whether it was a gratification, whether the 42 million has any link to the decision made in relation to the 4 billion loan, or was it for other purposes, for example, a donation. And the third is Datuk Sri's Najib's knowledge or state of mind in relation to the 42 million. Did he know whether the 42 million was misappropriated? If it was misappropriated, what was his involvement in any decisions or actions pertaining to the 42 million, if any? And were there other parties that could be responsible for this?
Sin Yew, if I could jump in there, and you've laid out the issues quite wonderfully there for us. I do want to ask you, this bundling together of these different charges, does it mean that he has to be convicted on all the charges or none at all? Or could he potentially be convicted on some but not others, or in fact acquitted of everything?
The judge has to make a decision for each of the 7 charges, and it must be considered separately. And there's only 2 outcomes for each of the charges, either to acquit or to convict. Any permutation of the 7 charges could be possible. Datuk Sri Najib could be acquitted of all 7 charges, or he could be acquitted of 6 and convicted of 1, or he could be convicted of all 7.
Okay, and if there is a guilty verdict, what options would Najib have?
Well, if Datuk Sri Najib is convicted of any or all of the 7 charges, the judge would have to sentence him. He could, of course, appeal his conviction. But firstly, he would have to mitigate any sentences that could be imposed against him. And based on the nature of the penalties that these charges carry, it is highly likely that Datuk Sri Najib will be disqualified from contesting as a candidate in any upcoming elections. Any fine exceeding RM2,000 or any imprisonment for more than 1 year would be sufficient to disqualify him. He would, however, not lose his seat as a member of parliament.
Right, so very quickly, in the last minute we have, what should the public keep in mind? It's a very politicized case in the sense that people have taken positions, as it were. What should they keep in mind if the verdict doesn't go in their favor, as it were, not in the way that they thought it would go?
I think the public, especially those who have been following this, they need to understand that whatever tomorrow's outcome would be, it is quite likely that there will be an appeal to the Court of Appeal as how these cases go. So to borrow a boxing term, if I may, this is just round 1, and there wouldn't be any knockout just yet.
Okay. Well, very nicely put. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. That's all the time we have on the show for this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.